It was Christmas evening. The kind of night that looked perfect from the outside, golden lights on the porch, laughter spilling out of the dining room, the scent of roasted turkey and pine drifting through the air. But underneath that glow, something inside me felt cold. My name is Carol Whitman. I'm 64 years old. And for most of my life, I've been the peacemaker, the one who held every cracked piece of this family together, no matter how sharp the edges were. That night, I stood by the doorway of my son's home, my coat still in my hands, watching faces I'd known my entire life. My sister Linda's polite smile didn't quite reach her eyes. My cousins whispered in the corner. And my son, Ethan, sat at the head of the table, tall, rigid, his gaze sharp as glass. He used to look at me with trust when he was little. But lately, it had turned into something colder, something that made me wonder when I had stopped being his mother and become a reminder of something he resented. The table shimmered with silverware, the kind you only bring out once a year. The conversations felt forced, like lines rehearsed too many times. I tried to breathe through it, to settle into the rhythm of clinking forks and muted laughter. I told myself, just get through tonight. Carol, one more dinner, one more act of peacekeeping. But then that moment, the one that changed everything. The chatter stopped all at once, as if someone had pulled the plug on the room's warmth. I didn't hear the exact words at first, I only felt the stillness. Then they came, cold and sharp, slicing through the quiet like glass words that didn't need to be shouted to wound. My own son, the boy I had once stayed up nights for, spoke as if I wasn't even human anymore. And I stood there, hearing him say something no mother should ever have to hear that. In their eyes, I was already gone. It was like time folded in on itself. My chest tightened. And for a second, I couldn't breathe. I remember gripping the edge of the table just to steady myself. I saw every Christmas past flash through my mind, every meal I had cooked, every gift I had wrapped, every apology I had whispered just to keep the peace. All of it felt meaningless in that single moment. Inside, 1,000 thoughts collided: disbelief, I hurt, and a quiet kind of shame that made me want to disappear. I wanted to shrink, to fade into the wallpaper, to let the night move on without me. But another voice rose beneath the fear. Small at first, then steady. No, not this time. As the silence stretched, I lifted my eyes to meet his. The room was holding its breath. I could feel every gaze on me, waiting, maybe for me to cry, or to beg, or to apologize for something I didn't even understand. But instead, I stood still. I didn't speak. I didn't defend myself. I just let the truth of it sink in: how easily love can turn to judgment. How quickly family can erase you when you stop being who they expect. And in that unbearable stillness, a question began to echo in my mind, quiet but persistent. How did it ever come to this? That question lingered long after the dinner ended, long after the lights dimmed. It followed me home that night, all the way into the silence of my living room. And somewhere between the ache in my chest and the hum of the refrigerator, I knew this wasn't the beginning of the end. It was the beginning of something else entirely, something I hadn't dared to name yet. But to understand how I got there, how a mother ends up hearing words like that from her own child, you'd have to start from the very beginning. When I think back to where it all began, I always find myself standing in that small yellow house in Indiana, the one with the squeaky porch steps and the smell of lemon cleaner that never quite faded. I was 7 when I first learned that silence was safer than truth. My mother, Diane, had a way of filling a room without ever raising her voice. Every gesture, every look from her meant something: a warning, a correction, or a reminder that I could always do better. My father, Paul, wasn't unkind, but he lived mostly in the background, I can still see him sitting at the kitchen table after dinner. The newspaper spread open like a shield, nodding along to whatever my mother said. I don't think he meant to disappear, but he did. And as a child, I took that as a sign that to survive in our home, you learn to keep your head down and your mouth shut. Then there was my sister, Linda. Everything about her seemed to shine. Her grades, her piano recitals, the way neighbors stopped my mom at the grocery store to say how wonderful she was. Linda didn't have to try to be perfect, she just was. And I spent most of my time trying not to be compared to her. There's this one memory that always comes back to me. I had drawn a picture for my mom, a watercolor of our backyard, with the big oak tree and the laundry line swaying in the wind. I remember being so proud, holding it out with both hands, waiting for her to see it. She smiled politely, told me to put it away before it dripped on the floor. Then she turned to Linda and asked her to play something on the piano. I watched as my painting curled at the edges on the counter, forgotten before it even dried. It seems small, doesn't it, just a moment? But moments like that taught me everything. I thought I needed to know that love was earned through achievement, that being quiet kept the peace, and that approval was the closest thing to affection I was ever going to get. At school, I learned to blend in. I never spoke up unless I was sure I had the right answer. I was terrified of being wrong, not because of punishment, but because disappointment cut deeper. When Linda teased me, I laughed along, pretending it didn't hurt. I became the girl who apologized even when she hadn't done anything wrong. Looking back now, I realize how deeply those lessons took root. I didn't know it then, but I was already rehearsing the role I would play for most of my life, the fixer, the peacekeeper, the woman who measures her worth by how calm everyone else feels. Even as a teenager, I could sense that I was being shaped into someone meant to serve, to smooth things over, to make others comfortable. Every time I wanted to speak up, I could hear my mother's voice in my head, telling me to mind my tone, to be graceful, to be better. It's strange how those messages follow you. They become part of your reflexes, the way you smile through hurt, the way you swallow frustration before it escapes your lips. I didn't understand it then, but the silence I learned as a child would grow into something much heavier later on. Because when you're taught to always keep the peace, you forget what your own voice sounds like. And by the time I was old enough to build a life of my own, I had no idea who I was beyond what others expected of me. I guess that's how it starts, not with a single wound, but with 1,000 quiet moments that teach you to disappear just a little at a time. And eventually, that pattern found its way into everything I touched, even into the family I built later. The marriage I thought would free me, and the son who would one day look at me with the same cold judgment I once saw in my mother's eyes. I got married young, 22, and full of the kind of hope that only comes from not knowing how hard life can be. His name was Robert, an engineer with steady hands and quiet eyes. He wasn't cruel, just distant, like someone who lived 2 steps outside of every room he entered. For a while, I told myself that was enough. After all, I had grown up believing peace was the same thing as love, that if things were calm on the surface, then everything must be fine underneath. When our son Ethan was born, everything shifted. Suddenly my whole world revolved around this tiny boy. I wanted him to have everything. I never did warmth, attention, the kind of love that didn't have to be earned. I promised myself I would be different from my mother. I would never let him feel invisible. But promises like that come with a cost. I poured myself so completely into motherhood that I forgot I was a person outside of it. I stopped painting, stopped reading for pleasure, stopped meeting friends after work. My dreams folded themselves neatly into a drawer, the same way my childhood drawings once had. Every decision revolved around what Ethan needed: his school, his activities, his comfort. There were nights when I sat at the kitchen table after he went to bed, bills spread out in front of me, too tired to even finish a cup of coffee. Robert was always working late or saying he was, and I didn't have the energy to question it. I picked up extra shifts at the office to cover expenses, packed lunches at midnight, drove Ethan to soccer and piano, and tutoring without complaint. It wasn't that anyone asked me to do it, it was just that I didn't know any other way to show love, except by giving everything I had. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, I'd feel a flicker of resentment, a whisper that asked, "What about you, Carol?" But I'd silence it before it could grow. Good. Mothers don't ask questions like that. I remember one Saturday vividly. Ethan was a teenager, sitting at the kitchen counter, talking about college plans, his eyes bright and excited. I listened and smiled, nodding in all the right places. But underneath that smile, there was a tug, a reminder of the art classes I'd once wanted to take, the book I'd started writing in my 20s, the places I'd dreamed of seeing. For a moment, I let myself feel that ache. Then I swallowed it. I told myself his future mattered more than mine ever could. That became the rhythm of my life, celebrating his achievements, while quietly mourning the parts of myself that disappeared along the way. And the more I gave, the more it seemed expected. Ethan grew used to me always being there, always smoothing things over, always ready to help. He didn't see the exhaustion behind my patience. Or maybe he did, and just didn't know what to do with it. As he grew older, our conversations changed. There was a distance in his tone that I couldn't quite reach through. He began to sound a little like my mother, certain, critical, dismissive. And I began to realize that, in raising him to have everything, I'd also taught him that I was the one thing he didn't need to notice. It's painful to admit that, to see how easily love can twist itself into servitude. I told myself I was doing it for him. But maybe, deep down, I was still trying to earn a kind of love I never learned to give myself. By the time I turned 45, my life was built entirely around other people's needs. I was the dependable one, the steady hand, the reliable mother, the woman who never said no, and yet, every time I looked in the mirror, I saw less and less of myself staring back. It would take many more years. And one final heartbreak, before I finally understood that giving everything isn't the same as being loved. Sometimes it's just another way to disappear. When Robert passed away, the world didn't stop. It didn't even slow down. The funeral came and went like a heavy rainstorm, brief, messy, and gone before I'd even had the chance to process it. I remember sitting in the quiet afterward. The house too clean. The air too still. People told me to take it easy, to rest, to let others help. But old habits don't break easily. Ethan was in college then, full of ambition and independence. He called when he needed money, when he needed advice. When something in his apartment broke, I always answered. I always found a way. I told myself that helping him gave me purpose. But really, I think I was terrified of what my life would look like without someone depending on me. The years after Robert's death blurred together. I worked longer hours at the administrative office, volunteered at church on weekends, cooked dinners for one, and pretended not to notice how quiet the house had become. When Ethan came home during holidays, it was as if I was hosting a guest, not welcoming a son. He spoke about his plans, his promotions, his life in the city, and I listened, nodding in all the right places. Sometimes he would look at me with polite impatience, as if I were a relic from a life he'd outgrown. I tried not to take it personally, but it stung. Every small gesture, every distant smile, carried the same unspoken message. You're not part of my world anymore. So I filled the silence with routine. Wake up at 6:30 a.m., coffee at 7, work by 8, home by 5:30, dinner for 1, sleep, repeat. The rhythm was predictable, safe. It left no room for disappointment, but no joy either. I told myself I was fine, that I was strong, that I didn't need much. Sometimes, on lonely evenings, I'd walk past the art supplies I kept tucked away in the closet. The brushes were stiff, the paints half-dried. I'd think about opening them. Maybe painting something simple, a flower, a sunrise, but the idea felt indulgent. I had responsibilities. I told myself, even if those responsibilities had long since stopped needing me, Ethan would call once every few weeks. Usually when something went wrong, a missed bill, a broken appliance, a decision he needed validated. He never asked how I was doing, and I never offered. I think part of me still believed that staying useful was the only way to stay loved. There were moments when the silence in that house felt almost alive. I'd hear the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, and I'd think, is this what my life has become, just noise and waiting? It's strange how loneliness can settle so quietly that you forget it's even there. You stop expecting warmth. Stop reaching for more. You convince yourself that this is what contentment looks like. But the truth is, I wasn't content. I was surviving. And deep down, a small part of me, the part that used to paint, the part that used to dream, was still waiting to be remembered. I didn't know it then, but those silent years were preparing me for something I couldn't yet see. A shift, a second chance, a life that, for the first time, would belong entirely to me. Retirement came quietly, not with a celebration or a farewell party, but with a simple email from HR and a box of personal things I carried to my car at 4:30 in the afternoon. I remember sitting there for a long while, the late sun spilling through the windshield, and realizing that for the first time in decades, my time finally belonged to me. It was both freeing and terrifying. The first few weeks felt strange. My mornings no longer began with alarms or office deadlines. Instead, I found myself lingering over coffee at the kitchen table, watching the light shift across the floor. At first, the silence felt like a punishment, but slowly, it started to sound like peace. One morning, I decided to visit a little cafe downtown, a place I had passed by for years but never entered because I was always rushing somewhere else. I sat by the window, ordered a muffin and a cup of black coffee, and for the first time, I didn't have to be anywhere. That small act felt revolutionary. Days began to take on a new rhythm. I signed up for an art class at the community center, the kind where retirees paint landscapes and talk about grandkids. I brought my old brushes, their bristles worn and stiff, and something inside me stirred the moment the paint touched the canvas. It wasn't about skill anymore. It was about remembering the part of me that had waited so long to breathe again. That's where I met Mark. He was arranging flowers for a community exhibit, careful and patient, like someone who respected time instead of fighting it. He had silver hair and kind eyes. And when we talked, it felt easy, no pretense, no expectation. He told me he spent his mornings tending a small garden by the lake. And for reasons I couldn't explain, that sounded like the most beautiful thing in the world. Our friendship started quietly. Walks by the water, shared lunches, small conversations that stretched into laughter. Mark never asked about my past, but he noticed when I hesitated, when I caught myself apologizing for taking up space. He had this way of reminding me, without words, that I didn't need to earn my right to exist. Little by little, I began to rebuild my life, not the one others had chosen for me, but the one I chose for myself. I opened a small savings account in my own name. Something private, sacred almost. Every month I tucked away a bit of money. Not much, but enough to feel like a promise to my future self. It wasn't about wealth, it was about independence. I filled my days with things that made me feel alive again. Art classes on Mondays, reading to children at the library on Saturdays, gardening with Mark on sunny afternoons. My hands, once always busy with chores, were now busy with creation colors. Soil, and joy. The funny thing is, my family had no idea. Ethan thought I spent my days cleaning, maybe watching TV. Linda would call once in a while, asking if I was lonely. As if my world had shrunk to the size of my living room. I let them believe it. I smiled quietly, thinking how liberating it was to hold a life they couldn't control. A happiness they didn't even imagine existed. I learned that freedom doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes in small, deliberate choices, like saying no without guilt. Like laughing too loudly at a cafe table. Like painting something just because you want to. Each morning, I woke up a little lighter. A little stronger. I no longer measured my worth by how much I gave to others, but by how much peace I allowed myself to feel. And as that new version of me began to take root, I could sense a shift coming. It was quiet but certain, a test of everything I had built. Everything I had reclaimed. I didn't know it yet. But the world I had carefully protected in secret was about to be exposed. It happened on a late winter afternoon. The kind of gray day when the sky feels too heavy and time moves too slowly. I was sitting by the window with a cup of tea. The quiet hum of the heater filling the apartment. When the doorbell rang once. Twice. 3 times in quick succession. It startled me. No one ever came by unannounced. When I opened the door, there they were, Ethan, Linda, and 2 of my cousins I hadn't seen in years. Their faces were tight, with something between concern and accusation. My heart sank before anyone said a word. I knew that look. I had seen it my whole life on my mother's face. On Linda's. Now, on my son's. It was the look people wear when they've already decided you're wrong. They said they wanted to talk. That phrase alone carried weight. It never really means a conversation. It means a confrontation dressed up as care. As they stood in my doorway, I could feel the old patterns pressing down on me: guilt, compliance, the urge to defend myself. For a moment, I almost stepped back into that role. Almost. But something in me had changed. The woman they had come to lecture wasn't the same one who had once lived for their approval. So I let them in. Calmly. Quietly. I listened as Ethan spoke first. His voice sharp, but trembling underneath. He told me I had been distant. That I was shutting the family out. That the life I was living wasn't right. He said I was neglecting the values he'd been raised with, as if he had been the one to teach them to me. As he spoke, I felt an odd stillness settle over me. The words washed past me. Familiar in tone but hollow in meaning. It was like hearing an echo of my mother's voice coming through my son's mouth. The same control. The same fear disguised as love. I realized, in that moment, that what he really couldn't accept wasn't my absence, it was my independence. Linda stepped in then. Softer, but no less insistent. She framed it as worry. But every sentence was wrapped in judgment. They spoke as if I had done something wrong by finding happiness outside the boundaries they set for me. I let them talk. I didn't interrupt. I wanted to see how far they'd go. And when the room finally fell quiet, when there was nothing left but the sound of the clock ticking on the wall, I took a slow breath and finally spoke from the place they could never reach, the one built on peace. Not fear. I told them I had spent a lifetime listening. A lifetime bending. A lifetime trying to be what everyone else needed. But not anymore. I reminded them, gently, that the life I had now was mine, built piece by piece. Moment by moment. With no permission but my own. Ethan's expression hardened. And I could see the storm rising behind his eyes. He wanted control. He wanted me to retreat. To be small again. But I didn't move. I didn't plead or apologize. I simply stood there. Anchored in a truth I had waited my whole life to claim. And then, as he tried once more to guilt me back into submission, I felt the words form before I even realized I was saying them, calm, final, and heavier than anything I had ever spoken. I told him, in the quietest voice. That the dead cannot come back. The room froze. For a heartbeat. No one moved. It wasn't anger that filled the air, it was understanding. The kind that comes too late. They finally saw it, the part of me they had buried under years of expectations had come back to life. And I wasn't going to give it up again. When they left, the air felt lighter. The door clicked shut. And for the first time, I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel cruel. I felt free. That night, as I sat by the window again, watching the snow fall under the streetlights, I realized that this confrontation wasn't about rejection. It was about rebirth. The version of me they once knew had been gone for a long time, and the woman who remained no longer needed their permission to exist. After they left, the apartment felt impossibly quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't ask for anything, not explanation, not apology, not performance, just quiet. The late afternoon light was spilling across the hardwood floor, turning everything gold. I sat down in my favorite chair by the window, the one where I read every morning, and I let the silence settle around me like a blanket. For the first time in years, my hands weren't shaking. I didn't replay the conversation in my head. I didn't second-guess the words I'd said. I just breathed long, slow breaths, and felt something inside me loosen. The weight I'd carried my entire life. That constant ache to please, to fix, to be enough, it was gone. A few minutes later, Mark appeared from the kitchen, holding a cup of tea. He didn't ask what had happened. He didn't need to. He simply set it down beside me and brushed his hand against mine. That small gesture said more than any words could. I realized then that love, real love, doesn't demand, doesn't control, doesn't shrink you. It lets you expand. Over the next few days, I noticed how different the air felt in my home. Lighter somehow. I went back to the art studio, picked up my pastels, and began working on a landscape, a series of winter skies over Lake Mendota. Each stroke of color felt like a reminder you survived. You're here. You're free. Friends started visiting more often. I hosted small brunches, filled the table with laughter and warmth instead of tension. I volunteered again at the library, reading stories to children who listened with wide eyes and unfiltered joy. On weekends, Mark and I walked by the lake, our hands brushing, our conversations easy and full of light. Every act, no matter how small, felt sacred. Because it was chosen. Because it was mine. There were still moments when I thought about Ethan and Linda. I wondered if they talked about that afternoon. If they understood what had really happened. But I didn't dwell on it. Their opinions no longer had the power to define me. I had stopped seeking their approval. And in doing so, I found something far more valuable: peace. The truth is, freedom doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's as soft as sunlight on wood floors or the warmth of a hand resting quietly over yours. One evening, as the snow fell gently outside, I looked around my little apartment and felt a deep calm settle in my chest. The woman I had become wasn't perfect or fearless, but she was whole. And in that moment, I understood that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply choose yourself, not out of anger, but out of love. It's been years since that winter afternoon, and sometimes I still catch myself marveling at how peaceful life feels when you stop asking for permission to live it. My mornings begin softly now, sunlight spilling across the apartment. The gentle hum of the city waking up outside. I make my coffee, open the window, and let the air move through the space like a quiet blessing. I kept painting. What started as a small hobby turned into something larger than I expected. A few local galleries began displaying my work: pastel landscapes, portraits of women who, in some way, were all versions of me. Each one told a story about rediscovering strength, about finding beauty in solitude. Standing there at those exhibits, I no longer felt like someone's mother or sister or daughter. I felt like myself. Mark and I still take our morning walks by the lake. We talk about everything and nothing, how the sky looks that day, what the ducks are doing, which wildflowers are starting to bloom. He laughs easily. And that sound has become a kind of music in my life. We don't talk about the past much anymore. We don't need to. It's enough to simply exist in the present, side by side, unburdened by what came before. As for my family, well, they've learned to keep their distance. Ethan has his own family now. And though we speak occasionally, the conversations are polite and surface level. I've stopped hoping for something deeper. Acceptance, I've learned, doesn't always look like reconciliation. Sometimes it's simply letting go without bitterness. There's a strange kind of freedom in realizing that peace isn't granted by anyone else. It isn't earned through perfection or obedience. It's something you claim, quietly but firmly. The moment you decide your happiness matters just as much as anyone else's. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that boundaries aren't walls, they're doors. And when you finally learn to close the ones that drain you, and you open the ones that bring you back to life. So if you've ever felt small in your own home, if you've ever silenced yourself to keep the peace, I hope my story reminds you that it's never too late to begin again. You are allowed to choose peace. You are allowed to choose yourself. And if this story touched something in you, share it. Maybe it'll find someone who needs to hear that it's okay to start over, no matter how long it's been. Because happiness isn't something we wait to be given. It's something we decide to claim.